Our first online lesson is operating systems, specifically Mac OS. Maybe you are just expecting a very simple PowerPoint presentation for this week's lesson. Pero naisip ko, it will not be fun for you to just read and read and read the history of Mac OS. It will not be that interesting. So I tried. I prepared this interactive presentation with my voice as the background, of course, to discuss the topic. And take note that I will stop somewhere in the middle of my discussion to ask you some questions. Let's start with the question, where did it all started? The Macintosh project started in the late 1970s. And this is Jeff Raskin, an Apple employee who visualized an easy-to-use and low-cost personal computer. The first Macintosh was introduced on January 24, 1984 by Steve Jobs, and it completely changed the computer history. It was the first computer to feature a GUI or graphical user interface, and also the first computer to use mouse. On the other hand, Bill Gates was a former employee of Apple, but he couldn't understand one thing. Why did Apple decided to keep Mac OS only for themselves? Why not license the Mac OS to other computer manufacturers who are willing to pay for it? But Bill Gates didn't get an answer, so he left Apple and developed and created Microsoft on 1985 to compete with Apple. This is the evolution of Macintosh computers, from the first version in 1984 to the Novo iMac, but it's already 2020 and we are now using the iMac 2018. This is the Apple Macintosh in 1984 and this is the latest, the Apple iMac Desktop of 2018. You can see how the physical design changed, but it is not just the hardware that is evolving, but also the software. Now, let's take a look at how the software such as operating systems evolved all throughout the years. But first, what is an operating system? An operating system or OS is a software that allows your hardware and software to communicate with each other. And without the operating system, you will not be able to use your computer. Here are some operating systems for computers and smartphones. We have Windows, Apple, Ubuntu, and for your smartphones, we have Android and iOS. Now let's discuss them one by one. First, we have the Windows. This is the latest version of Windows, Windows 10. And Windows is the most commonly used operating system thanks to Bill Gates. We have now the Mac OS. Mac OS can only be used in Apple devices. So if you want to use Mac OS, you need to have an Apple device. And this one, something that you might not be familiar with, the Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a free and open source operating system. Remember that for you to use Windows, you need to pay for license. That is yearly. And for you to use Mac OS, of course, you need an Apple device. But for Ubuntu, it is completely free. Now, next is your operating systems for your smartphones. We have now the Android. Android is a product of Google. It is the commonly used operating systems for smartphones, just like Windows and your computers. Next, we have iOS. Same with Mac OS. If you want to use an iOS, of course, you need an Apple device, which is an iPhone or an iPod. Now let's start with the history of Mac OS. But take note that I will stop somewhere in the middle of my discussion to ask you some questions. Two versions were released in 2001. Cheetah introduced the apps like Text Edit, Preview, Mail, and QuickTime. On the other hand, Puma focused on improving the system's performance. In 2002, Jaguar was released. It featured new applications like iChat and Address Book. It also introduced universal access that allowed Mac OS to be used by people with disabilities. On 2003, Panther was released. It introduced Safari as its default web browser. 1 year after that, on 2004, Tiger was introduced with the Spotlight search and widgets like calculator, calendar, and clock. In 2007, Leopard allowed the users of Apple devices to install other operating systems like Windows thanks to Boot Camp. 2 years after, Snow Leopard was released with the new Mac App Store. And in 2011, Lion was the first operating system which was not available on CDs and DVDs anymore, and it is now downloadable operating system. Mountain Lion on 2012 replaced iChat with a new message application. And there are two versions released in 2013. The first version is a free upgrade, and the second version is the biggest design change in years of Mac OS. In 2015, El Capitan was released. It focused on performance and stability improvements. Additionally, split view feature was introduced. A year after, Sierra was introduced with Apple Pay and Apple Watch for Safari. In 2017, High Sierra was released, which brings faster file operations and better security. And lastly, Mojave. It is the latest version of Mac OS and it is very visual update. It introduced dynamic desktop that features the dark mode. Do you think it is worth it to buy an Apple device for Mac OS? Or are you interested to explore other operating systems like Ubuntu?